Chapter 7. Hurley's Dreams. With mine own tears I wash away my balm, with mine own hands I give away my crown, with mine own tongue deny my sacred state, with mine own breath release all duteous oaths, all pomp and mystery I do forswear. Shakespeare, King Richard II, 4.1, verse 201 to 205. In politics, the Shah had a baptism of fire. He was a reluctant young king on a shaky throne in the turbulent years of the Second World War, amid a hotbed of fierce competition between the war's competing forces. Before the first decade of his tenure ended, he would witness the creation of breakaway republics in two of Iran's biggest provinces, the dawn of the Cold War, an assassination attempt on his life, and open challenges to his power from some of the prime ministers he had reluctantly appointed. During this first decade, the Shah also convened the Constituent Assembly to increase his own constitutional powers. Contrary to the common perception that during his first years in power, the Shah happily resigned himself to his limited constitutional role. He was in fact trying to regain as much of his father's power as possible. In the meantime, many in the Western media, enamored with the romance of royalty, were busy turning the new Shah into an exotic Oriental monarch. On September 21st, 1942, the cover of Life magazine was dedicated to a Cecil-beaten portrait of a woman of exotic beauty. She had sad and mournful eyes, pitch-black hair, a perfectly sculpted face, and soft, graceful hands bereft of the wrinkles of labor, holding a small sprig of bluebells, and she wore an elegantly cut dark dress strewn with designs of light pansies. A diamond-studded necklace and a cloisonné fish pendant hung from her neck. The caption read, "The Queen of Iran." The beaten portrait was a metaphor for an important change in the cultural sensibilities of the Pahlavi court. Reza Shah had been unmistakably local in his desires and dispositions. The glitterati, the international jet-set celebrity photography, and haute couture were altogether alien to his taste. But his older son, the new Shah, had been educated in Europe. His wife, Fazia, was steeped in the modes and manners of European royalty and high fashion. In portraits of her while she was still in Egypt, she wore the hats and the bags and the dresses and the gloves of a Hollywood glamour girl. Also included in the same issue of Life was a picture of a dapper Shah. By the time Beaton came to Tehran, the Shah, too, had already started having his shirts made by the exclusive house of Solka in Paris. He was a true creature of habits. The same shirt maker for almost 3 decades, the same Italian tailor, even the same dentist in Switzerland, where he traveled for regular checkups. Every morning his valet set out for him what he was to wear that morning. Late each night the valet received a copy of the Shah's engagements for the next day, and, based on the exigencies of these meetings, Late each night the valet received a copy of the Shah's engagements for the next day, and based on the exigencies of these meetings, the valet would choose and lay out that day's clothes. Still, the valet's choice was limited to the wardrobe accumulated by the Shah himself. By the mid-70s, the Shah's strangely large, dark-rimmed glasses, his big lapelled suits, and his daring ties were a radical departure from the staid, somber trim and fit-contoured suits he was wearing when Life magazine published a photo gallery of him and his family in 1942. Page 96 of The War-Consumed Life showed the Baton pictures of the Iranian royal family. In spite of the clear attempt by Life's editors to show a happy family, the pictures inadvertently revealed fissures and tensions that would soon break out into the open. There was a photo of a debonair Shah sitting on a bench in the palace garden, his daughter on his lap, and Queen Fawzia sitting a few noticeable inches away. Their dour expressions betrayed what was by then an open secret in Tehran. The queen was unhappy. Compared with her family's almost 2 centuries old history of kinship, the Pahlavi royal pedigree was thin, and thus many in the Shah's family construed Fawzia's natural reserve and shyness as a haughty and dismissive demeanor. The article described Iran as the threatened supply link between Russia and the Allies. Of the royal marriage, it ventured the guess that few marriages have weathered as much. Fawzia's dynasty is 100 years old and rich. The Shah's only 17 years and poor. The two are different sects of Islam, and finally, alluding to some of the machinations in the court, it said, Iranians come to say she had a bad luck, as she produced only a daughter. Many years later, in 1961, when the Shah published his memoirs, he claimed for the first time that her failure to produce a male heir was the factor in the breakup of their marriage. The Life article ended by referring to the Shah as a king on probation, while the Soviet and British governments may have viewed him this way. In reality, the Shah was surprisingly active and assertive. In 1941, around the time he took the oath of office, he was busy at the court remaking it in his own image. One of his first steps was to dismiss his chief of staff, Moaddeb Nafisi, who had earlier accompanied him on his Larosi journey and was, according to the British Embassy, a useless yes-man. The new court minister was Hussein Allah, a second politician who was also the preferred British candidate for the job. According to Anne Lambton, it was, more than anyone else, Allah who convinced the British that the Crown Prince should be given a chance. Allah was considerably older than the Shah and soon developed a kind of avuncular disposition toward the young monarch. He tried to educate the Shah by giving him useful books to read, including the works of Bernard Shaw. Allah was not the only person trying to educate the young Shah. The British ambassador, Sir Reeder Bullard, was also active in this pedagogical effect, and in his own words, managed to excite the interest of the Shah in Thucydides. In return, the Shah sent Bullard a painted Persian box full of Persian nuts, and the ambassador lamented that financially he was the loser in the deal. Of the educators, the earliest, of course, was Ernest Perron, who was, after Reza Shah's abdication, a constant presence at the court and continued the practice of sharing books and poems with the Shah. The Shah also used him in some of the most sensitive missions, from deciding court protocol and insisting on courtiers emulating the ways of European courts, to acting as the Shah's emissary in contacting foreign embassies or resolving some of the tensions in the quarrelsome royal family. By the time a nervous Shah entered the Majlis around 4:30 in the afternoon on September 17, 1941, and took the oath of office, his father was already on his way out of the country. Another request of the Allies, particularly the British, was that the new Shah expel from Iran Reza Shah's many sons from his 4 marriages. Most would leave the country with Reza Shah, but the Shah reassured the British that he would also send away the 2 remaining members of the royal family, vis-a-vis his mother and his sister, Princess Ashraf, who is said to hanker after a career in Hollywood. Though the biting tone of the rest of the report is indicative of the Assembly's troubled relationship with the princess, hobnobbing with Hollywood celebrity remained, all her life, something of a passion. Within 5 years of the Shah's making that promise, every member of the royal family was back in Iran, and before long, Princess Ashraf and the Queen Mother once again took on increasingly powerful and controversial roles in Iran's domestic politics and in the Shah's private life. Within 30 years, Princess Ashraf even found her way to a career in Hollywood, not as an actress, but as a producer. But in 1941, the Shah was in no position to defend his family's desire to live in Iran. A photo of the Shah entering the Parliament building to take the oath of office captures the frailties of his personality and position. Though dressed in a full military uniform and knee-high boots with the ornate sword of power dangling from his waist, much like his father in official ceremonies, the young Shah looked tentative, almost sunken and shrunken in his uniform. He had more the defensive pose of an anxious officer than the joyful defiance of a prince bent on putting his seal of authority on a shaky peacock throne. A large crowd had gathered outside the Parliament to show their support for the king. Why and how they had come there remains the subject of some controversy. The Shah says it was all the spontaneous exhibition of love by his people. In his memoirs, he writes of being confirmed on the throne by popular support. Some embassies, however, believed the people gathered on the few streets between the court and the Parliament were part of a rented crowd, gathered by royalists to breathe a whiff of confidence into the Shah's badly shaken resolve. No sooner had the Shah taken the oath of office than he was faced with the plethora of problems. His first challenge was the fate of his father. The young Shah's first speech after taking the oath of office reflected the precarious position in which his father had left him. He promised to pay full attention to the principles of a constitutional government and to the separation of the 3 branches mandated by law. Every citizen in the country, he said, must be vigilant about the responsibilities and must never lose sight of the limits of governmental power. I have ordered all government employees, he went on to say, to make sure that they follow the letter of the law. These promises to abide by the Constitution in the future were a clear, albeit tacit, confirmation that his father had acted in breach of those very laws. As the Shah was making his speech, his father was on his way to Isfahan, his first stop on the way to uncertain destination. The sight of the plume-plucked Reza Shah carrying a suitcase was, for his family, unfathomable. It has never been clear what was in the suitcase. 3 decades later, in his daily journals, Asadullah Alam referred to certain documents inherited from Reza Shah, kept in those days by the Shah in a safe, and so sensitive that Alam felt he could still not talk about them. Are these documents the same material Reza Shah so carefully guarded while on his journey of banishment? When he got out of an old unmarked car to meet his family, having already been ensconced in Isfahan for some time, Reza Shah looked old and pale. During his days as a king or a Cossack commander, he was never seen carrying anything other than his staff. Now he carried around a suitcase from which he never parted. To his family, he seemed a tragically broken man. After leaving Tehran, Feryidun Jam, Reza Shah's son-in-law, remembered, there was never any life in his eyes. The joy of life seemed to slip away from him with every passing day. Reza Shah's mantra in those days was, "I would rather die in Iran than go abroad." His once intimidating gravitas and charisma turned rapidly to grief and despair. A bitter reminder of his fallen state was the fact that it was not even clear whether he stopped in Isfahan. Of his own volition, or as suggested by the American embassy. The British held him for negotiations as to the disposition of his properties. Newspapers in the country were by then filled with rumors and stories about his allegedly fantastic and illicit fortune. A few members of the Parliament and many opposition papers even alleged that on his way out of Iran, Reza Shah had taken some of the crown jewels, a vast collection of thousands of rare jewels, and some other gems brought back by Nader Shah after he invaded India. Early in his tenure, Reza Shah established the Iranian National Bank. Meli, by 1931, ordered the bank to take over the power of mintage for the Iranian currency, until then in the hands of the British. The jewels were at the time used as the main backing for this currency. But as the Iranian currency was rapidly losing its value, the new Shah was busy trying to convince the people and the Parliament that his father had not pilfered the royal jewels. In Isfahan, Reza Shah, at the apparent urging of the British, was begrudgingly transferring all his assets to his oldest son, the Shah. To assuage public fears about the allegedly missing crown jewels, a committee of trusted public servants and 12 members of the Majlis were chosen to take a reliable inventory of the jewels and to establish whether any were actually missing. After several visits to the National Bank depository, where the jewels were held, the committee concluded that none of the jewels were missing and cleared Reza Shah of any wrongdoing. While it has been something of a favorite national pastime in Iran to see the British hand behind every political turn of event, and while the Shah and his father both attributed much of what happened to them at least partially to the British hand, the decision to raise the issue of the crown jewels against Reza Shah was one of the cases where the British were indeed involved. When the British Embassy learned of the committee's findings and of the planned appearance by Iran's acting Minister of Finance before a session of the Majlis to swear that crown jewels are still in the bank, Sir Reeder Bullard sent an urgent telegram to the Foreign Office saying, "It is probably true that such jewels as were deposited were still there, but I believe that many of the most valuable had been taken by the Shah and made up into tiaras, etc., and that these, in fact, were sent away when ladies of the royal family left." The ambassadors then offered a draft of what should be broadcast over the BBC. The broadcast, Bullard suggested, should declare, "It is alleged that crown jewels are still in the banks of Tehran. What public want to know is whether all the crown jewels were ever deposited in the bank. Were some kept back? Was it these that were taken away from Tehran recently by the chief of police, who made a mysterious journey? There must be a list of the crown jewels. Public inquiry is essential." Even in recent years, critics of Reza Shah have continued to insist that the best parts of the jewels had already been taken by Reza Shah before the full inventory was even taken. The evidence for these later allegations, as well as for those made by the British Embassy, is little more than guesswork and innuendo. The British had two apparent motives for their unusual interest in Iran's crown jewels. The British wanted a free hand in running Iran, and a self-assured Shah was the last thing they wanted. Moreover, in those days, the British government was engaged in a tug-of-war with Iranian officials over the rate of exchange between the two countries' currencies. Hoping to lessen the cost of keeping their soldiers in Iran, the British pressured Iranian officials to devalue the Iranian currency. Surely, if the crown jewels, as the Iranian currency main backing, were pilfered, then the value of the Iranian currency would fall. In Isfahan, one of Reza Shah's biggest concerns was obviously the fate of his fortune. Not long after his arrival, lawyers and notaries carrying files and forms began arriving at his residence. The house of the Khazaruni family, successful Iranian textile manufacturers who had greatly benefited from Reza Shah's policy of support for domestic industries. Moreover, a tailor was called to make Reza Shah a civilian suit. Ever since joining the Cossack Brigade as a boy and all through his days as a king, he had usually never worn anything other than his military uniforms, most of them made from fabric manufactured by the Khazaruni industries. Even the socks he wore were those made of coarse wool and used by soldiers. When in exile, he needed new socks, and Feryadun Jam brought him some from the local store. Reza Shah, shocked at the price paid for them, rejected the whole package, asking instead for the rough woven wool socks of his past. Knowing his taste, Jam said, I had not even bought him fancy socks. Nevertheless, he refused to wear them. Reza Shah was also uncomfortable in the new suits that were hurriedly tailored for him. His shrunken power, maybe the weight of his grief, seemed to have shrunken his body. In every picture after he was unkinged, his body seems barely able to hold up his drooping suits. Having surrendered his power, he was now forced to surrender his wealth. In a terse note, he transferred the ownership of all his properties, whether in cash or in real estate, stocks or bonds, to his oldest son and new Shah. A key facilitator of this transfer was Ibrahim Quavim, nominally his daughter's father-in-law, and the same man who had negotiated on his behalf in Tehran on the eve of the country's occupation. By then, all semblance of a relationship between Gavam's son, Ali, and Reza Shah's daughter, Ashraf, had ended. Even in signing the deed of donation that transferred his wealth, Reza Shah tried to justify his virtual confiscation of about 2,000 of the country's most fertile and beautiful villages at a nominal price throughout his tenure. He wrote that since ascending the throne, he aimed only at the development, prosperity, and growth of the country, and he took over the properties as an example and model for the landlords. By the time the Crown Prince returned home from Switzerland, His father, the once poor soldier, who had lived in a rented house with his first son when his first son was born, had become the richest man in Iran. The U.S. ambassador in Tehran at the time reported on Reza Shah's economic activities, wrote, "There was little of value in the country, in fact, in which he was not interested. His greed knew no bounds, and in addition to acquiring a large part of Mazandaran, he bought city properties, built hotels, and operated factories. He took any and all lands he wanted to his avaricious bosom under formal or implied threat of some kind of harm to the owners. He paid whatever pleased him to pay, usually a 10th or 20th part of the value. After Reza Shah's abdication, when the issue of his wealth became the subject of a heated national debate, the Iranian Prime Minister told the parliament that Reza Shah had cash deposits in Iranian banks amounting to the unbelievable sum of 68 million reals, $4.25 million. This amounted to 46% of the entire liquidity of the Iranian government. Other scholars have offered even larger figures for the total amount of money amassed by Reza Shah in his accounts in Iran. One source, for example, claims that the $4.25 million figure referred only to Reza Shah's savings account, and that there was another 85 million reals, $5.3 million, in the checking account. This fantastic but contested fortune now belonged to the young Shah. In the deed of donation prepared in the office of the public notary, number 17, in the city of Isfahan, with Muhammad Jam acting as a witness, Reza Shah offered as a gift and present to his eldest son all his properties and chattels, whether movable, immovable, factories, etc., whatsoever, in return for 10 grams of sugar, that he may apply them in charitable, national, educational, etc., in such manner as he may deem it expedient. In the parlance of Shiite legalists, this practice, common in Iran, was called Habe Kardan, making a coerced transfer of property legitimate by making it appear as a voluntary sale in exchange for the payment of a cube of sugar. In monarchies, political primogeniture is the norm, but this was a case of economic primogeniture, in which millions of dollars were bequeathed to one son, and everyone else in the large, sometimes bickering family of his 3 living wives was left virtually penniless. At the time the transfer took place, the Shah's siblings did not complain about their father's decision. After a few months, when the political dust of succession had settled, Reza Shah's other sons and daughters, as well as his other living wives, began to grumble about the arrangement, demanding their share of the inheritance. Reza Shah retracted and ordered the young Shah to transfer to each sibling 1,000,000 tumen, about 500,000, and the deed to their individual palace within the Sahad Abad compound. The rest of Reza Shah's vast fortune remained in the Shah's hands, and as he learned the hard way, the specter of the fortune continued to haunt him for the rest of his political life. By the time of Reza Shah's abdication, the issue of this fortune had become so controversial that the Shah ascended the throne only after promising first to the British and Soviet governments, and then to the people of Iran, that he would return all properties illegally confiscated by his father back to the lawful ones. The political landscape of Iran had in those days been changed by the plethora of newly formed opposition groups and papers and had burst onto the political scene. The British Embassy estimated the number of new parties to be more than 100. The most powerful of these parties was as much the creation of the Soviet occupying forces as the result of the new-found freedoms. It was called the Tudeh Party, the party of the masses. It was, in every aspect, Iran's de facto new communist party. Stalin was now an ally of the West and did not want to disturb the sensitive alliance between the Socialist Soviet Union and its capitalist allies. As a result, he ordered the new communist parties, as well as those already established, to pursue the policy of forging a united anti-fascist front with all forces willing to resist Hitler and his allies. In Iran, one manifestation of this strategy was the new party's decision to eschew any overt affiliation with the communist name, lest it frighten away religious and moderate forces who could come together in the coveted united front. The fact that Reza Shah had passed a law banning any organization that espoused a collective creed added to the urgency of avoiding an overtly communist collectivist ideology. In order to fight the left's sudden power and influence, a fear soon augmented by the gradual dawning of the Cold War, and to improve his own image in the country, the Shah launched a three-pronged policy. He began donating large sums of money to different public causes. This was essentially in lieu of his promise to return the ill-gotten gains he inherited from his father to their rightful owners. In the same spirit, he also undertook a kind of unilateral, individual land reform and sold at discount prices some of the farmlands formerly called royal properties. The land was distributed amongst the peasants who had long toiled on it, not the landowners from whom the property was initially purchased. The Shah also tried to give some of his controversial fortune back through publicized acts of philanthropy. The donations varied in their size and intended use. On September 27, 1941, he announced 15 different donations ranging from money to build 3 new medical schools around the country, a homeless shelter in Tehran, and a nursery to funds set aside to support research in science and medicine. It has never been clear how many of these promised charitable institutions were in fact ever launched. There was also the question of the funds Reza Shah had allegedly stashed away in foreign banks. Relying on the Shah's repeated declarations, and upon hearing from a British government that they had no specific information on the whereabouts of Reza Shah's foreign fortune, the Foroughi cabinet eventually issued a terse statement declaring that we have so far found no evidence that Reza Shah had any accounts in foreign banks. In spite of its declaration of ignorance, the British government continued to monitor the new Shah's financial activities. Their efforts soon bore surprising fruit. Only months after the new Shah had come to power, the British government intercepted a telegram from a European bank to an American financial institution and learned that the Shah has $1 million in America, and that he is now looking for a safe investment for his money. 2 years later, the Shah opened another private account for himself in Guarantee Trust Company in the United States. Only this time, the sum was being transferred from one of the Shah's bank accounts in Iran. According to a March 10, 1943 telegram from the U.S. ambassador to the State Department, the rituals with which the dollars were purchased were part of the more than 600 millions left by the Shah Reza to present Shah. It would appear that Shah desires to have money abroad for 2 reasons: to take care of himself and family should he ever have to leave Iran, and because he is being mulcted out of his money through contributions under pressure from charitable and other purposes. An interesting aspect of this second transfer is the way the Shah went about doing it. Realizing that he must try and keep all such foreign account transactions and transfers away from the public and the media, the Shah successfully convinced the American embassy to allow him to use their diplomatic pouch for all correspondence about his bank accounts. On another occasion, the British embassy in Tehran reported from what it called a reliable source. The Shah was buying large quantities of foreign exchange. According to the British embassy, the Shah's concern for his foreign assets was because he foresees popular opposition to his attempt to secure complete control of the army. In later years, as the issue of his wealth in foreign banks continued to remain a sensitive political issue, the question of using America's diplomatic pouch remains a viable option and a temptation for the Shah. Making donations was the first element of the Shah's three-pronged strategy for consolidating the monarchy. The second was his decision to fight fire with fire. Responding to the sudden creation of hundreds of newspapers around the country, most of them critical of him and his father, he began paying a subsidy to a number of journalists, hoping they would defend him. The British government tried to dissuade the Shah from these efforts, but their advice seems to have had little practical effect. Amongst the most enduring such ties was that with Ali Asghar Amirani, the editor of Khandan Nida, Iran's homegrown version of Reader's Digest. For the next 3 decades, Amirani played a complicated role in Iranian journalism, often critical of politicians, always faithful to the Shah. In the arena of cultivating ties with journalists, the Shah's boldest step was his eventual decisions to launch a paper whose job would be to present the point of views of the monarchy. As the publisher, he chose a young, talented, French-trained lawyer professor by the name of Mostafa Mezbahzadeh. Before long, the daily paper Kayan was launched, with the Shah providing a check from his personal account for 200,000 tumen as seed money. Abdulrahman Farmararze, one of the country's most esteemed journalists of the time, became the paper's editor-in-chief. A few weeks after the checks for the seed money was paid, the Shah was given the equivalent of 200,000 tumen worth of stock in the company set up to publish Kayan. The Shah did not keep the stock for himself, but made a gift of them to Hussein Fardost, who claims he never cashed the shares but instead kept them in his basement as a relic. The Shah also felt that some of the attacks in the Iranian media were investigated by foreign powers. In some cases, he tried to solve the problem by directly negotiating with representatives of the country allegedly responsible for the attack. For example, after Saeed Zia returned home from 22 years of exile and launched a paper that immediately began to criticize the Shah for the breach of the constitution and attacked Reza Shah for stashing away millions in his bank accounts, the Shah sent his court minister, Hussein Alba, to meet with British embassy officials. The Shah told the British embassy should be immune from attacks. The embassy's response was as interesting as the Shah's gesture. Instead of repeating the standard line about not interfering in Iran's domestic affairs, this time they told Allah that the attacks were payback for the fact that the Shah had breached his truce with Saeed Zia. In fact, the embassy had come to believe that Mossadegh, at the time a member of Majlis and in a few years Prime Minister, was one of the Shah's men, and thus implied the attacks by Saeed Zia on the Shah were payback for his alleged alliance with the Mossadegh. The third most important component of the Shah's three-pronged strategy for consolidating power, and the one that marked the sharpest departure from the policies of Reza Shah, was his attempt to reconcile with the clergy. The Shah and his father shared nearly every element of their respective paradigms of authoritarian modernization. They both believed in the indispensable necessity of an authoritarian monarch in place of a king who reigned, not ruled, according to the letter of the Iranian constitution. They both afforded a key, if not decisive role, to the state in not only jump-starting the economy on its march to progress, but making investments in key industries and controlling the economy, in place of free markets and the force of market mechanism. They were both willing to use the coercive power of the state to replace market mechanisms, even control prices, and fight inflation. The Shah and his father both believed that key sectors of the economy must remain a monopoly of the state. Neither was averse to the idea of expropriating trailblazing investors in the interest of achieving such monopoly, or of eliminating the possibility of the emergence of an entrepreneurial class rich and powerful enough to challenge the king's claims to absolute power. They both valued industrialization and believed that having a steel mill was the ultimate economic and symbolic measure of modernity. They both believed in using agriculture to facilitate industrial development. They both wanted a more educated working class, a larger and better trained technocratic class, a larger middle class. They both believed women should be fully enfranchised members of Iranian society. They both saw Iran's future tied to the West and were committed to fighting communism. They both saw urbanization as a key to progress, and they believed in the urgency of a modernized infrastructure. They were both fierce advocates of cultural and aesthetic modernity, so long as it did not tread in political waters. For both, Iran's imperial grandeur, in its pre-Islamic days, was the essential ingredient of a new national cultural identity for the country, and they both considered a strong military under their own direct control a necessary element for the success of their modernization project and for the maintenance of the country's security and of their own hold on power. In this sense, the Shah's desire for a large military was even stronger than his father's. The craving is particularly remarkable when we remember that the young Shah had seen with great sadness and surprise how quickly his father's much vaunted military all but disappeared overnight. But father and son differed, and differed drastically in their views on the role and place of religion and the clergy in their paradigms. Reza Shah, acting in a spirit much like that of Ataturk in Turkey, moved aggressively to limit the role and number of the clergy in Iran. From the time he took over in 1925 to the time he left the country in 1941, though the population had more than doubled, the number of mosques had been reduced by half, turning some to schools, cinemas, and in one case, an opera house. Before then, the idea of converting a mosque, even one in a state of derelict disrepair, to some other use had been nothing short of sacrilege. An expression in the Persian vernacular captures the essence of this convention. To compare someone to the door of a mosque is to imply sardonically that, in spite of their uselessness, they are irremovable from the position they hold. Reza Shah changed all of that and put many old mosques to modern use. The reduction in the total number of the clergy in the country was even greater. He also moved to deprive the clergy not just of their revenues from running the judicial system, but of their lucrative guardianship of Waqf religious endowments that covered such institutions as mosques, seminaries, and hospitals, and that had been considered a crucial element in the backwardness of traditional Islamic economies. The Shah, on the other hand, saw the clergy, the inconvenience of their radical minority notwithstanding, as an indispensable ally against communists, and his new paradigm was evident from his first days on the peacock throne. His faith and his belief that he was indeed God's anointed added a sense of personal poignancy to this political paradigm. A few years after ascending the throne, he claimed that Islamic tenets are humanity's source of salvation. Following these rules in my time and in any other will bring common welfare and comfort. To realize his dream of using the clergy against his enemies, the Shah took important steps. He helped to drastically increase the number of mosques in the country, and he made peace with the mullahs. During his tenure, the number of mosques increased to more than 55,000. Some say 75,000. The number of religious schools also witnessed a sharp rise, going from 154 to 214 in 1960. The rise in the second half of the Shah's rule was even greater. On June 3, 1943, Ayatollah Hossein Ghomi, virtually exiled by Reza Shah 8 years earlier, returned home to a hero's welcome. Even before returning, he had let it be known amongst religious circles that he was returning home at the direct invitation of the Shah. He was not lying. The Shah had sent a special envoy, Zainal Abidin Ranama, a writer of renown and a critic of Reza Shah, who was known for his extensive contacts amongst the clergy, to Iraq, and entrusted him with the task of bringing back Ayatollah Ghomi. Ironically, the British embassy was one of the few voices warning the Shah against bringing back the powerful Ayatollah. But the Shah was undeterred. By then, he had come to conclude that mullahs are all royalists at heart. They knew that Islam could not survive in Iran without the monarchy. The monarchy, the Shah often said, is the only reliable bulwark standing in the way of Iran's becoming a secular or a communist society. And the mullahs, he believed, knew this. What the Shah failed to realize is that some mullahs might well have believed all of this, but might also have had dreams of power themselves. Ayatollah Ghomi was afforded a hero's welcome by both the government and the people. The police in Tehran reported that some 100,000 people had gathered near Ghomi's temporary residence to welcome him. The only public protest against the treatment afforded the returning Ayatollah came from Ahmed Khazravi, the eminent historian, social critic, and sometime prophet of his own new Bedini doctrine, the good faith religion. Khazravi had also written a daring critique of Shi'ism. In those days, in the seminary in the city of Qum, a new young rabble-rousing cleric named Nawab Safavi had emerged, taking the fiery language of revolution and espousing the view that Muslims must take up arms in defense of their faith, in silencing heretics, and in creating an Islamic state. The more traditional Ayatollahs, particularly Ayatollah Borujerdi, who was rapidly emerging as the preeminent leader of the Shiites in the world, disdained Safavi and ordered other mullahs to stay clear of him and his brand of radical Islam. Ayatollah Khomeini took exception to this command and began to cultivate close ties with Safavi, who went on to create the Fedayeen Islam, Martyrs of Islam, easily the most successful terrorist organization in modern Iran. The group's first target would be Khazravi, who was brutally mutilated in March 1946 as he was being deposed on a pending lawsuit in the Ministry of Justice. Safavi had himself earlier tried but failed to assassinate Khazravi. The Shah would hear of this group's existence only after they had committed their first murder. There was no independent intelligence organization at the time. Special units in the military and police performed the functions of an intelligence agency, but their work was focused on fighting communism. Before long, the Fedayeen-e-Islam would focus its wrath on the Shah and its ministers. It was in this context that Ayatollah Khomeini returned home in triumph. A few days after settling back into his native city of Mashhad, Ayatollah Khomeini wrote a note to the governor of the province demanding action on the issues he claimed he had raised with the Shah. Before long, he sent another note, this time to Prime Minister Ali Sohaili, and surprisingly haughty in tone, raising the same issues. Finally, on August 20th, 1943, the Ayatollah received a letter from the Prime Minister informing him that all of his demands would be met. Ayatollah Khomeini had demanded the abolition of the law banning women from appearing in public wearing scarves and veils. As the Prime Minister's letters make clear, women would henceforth be allowed to appear in public any way they chose. The Ayatollah's second demand was a reversal of Reza Shah's policy of putting religious endowments, Vakf, under government control. The management of these properties, according to the Prime Minister's letter, was to be returned to those stipulated in the endowment letter. In most cases, the clergy, in agreeing to the Ayatollah's third demand, the government decided to make classes on Islamic theology and ethics a mandatory part of the curriculum in Iranian schools. The clergy were just in charge of determining the context of these classes. Ayatollah Khomeini also demanded the closing of co-educational schools around the country that had arisen toward the end of Reza Shah's period. Every one of the Ayatollah's major demands was, on the order of the Shah, accepted by the government and became policy. The clergy was always in tune with the political pulse of society, realized that a new era had begun and that Reza Shah's policy of weakening them had ended. When in 1945 Ayatollah Boroujerdi was hospitalized in Tehran, the Shah made a point of making a much publicized visit to his bedside. The visit symbolized the Shah's new policy. Caught in a fierce battle for control with powerful prime ministers and a rising tide of communist activism, the Shah in those days went so far as to advocate the clergy's active participation in politics. The clergy, he said, shoulder a great responsibility in ensuring that the state does not at any time veer off the path of tending to the needs of the people. He lived to rue the day he uttered those words. But in those days, ambitious prime ministers like Qavam al-Sultaneh Ahmad Qavam were a more pressing threat. The Shah first encountered the problem in 1942, when, much to his surprise and in spite of his resistance, he was forced to name Qavam prime minister. Only a few months earlier, the British and Soviet governments had both been adamantly opposed to a Qavam appointment. Now they were both his chief proponents. Both had considered Qavam a Nazi sympathizer. British support for Qavam was particularly startling in that, according to their own sources, he had not only participated in planning a coup attempt with Nazi Germany, but had later met with Ali Akbari, a special Nazi convoy sent to Iran to coordinate further pro-Nazi activities, including seizing power when Nazi troops arrived near Iran's borders. But somehow, in 1942, Qavam had overcome British and Soviet objections and became their favorite candidate for the post of prime minister. The fact that the United States was also in favor of Cavam's appointment at the time was not surprising. After all, it was Cavam who, during his first tenure as Prime Minister in the early 1920s, had tried to get American oil companies, particularly Standard and Sinclair, interested in Iranian oil. Now, somehow, Cavam had also convinced the Soviets and the British that he was the man of the hour. All three governments afforded his cabinet their full support. Cavam had first become Prime Minister in 1922, when the Shah was 3 years old, and his ambitions clearly went far beyond ensuring that the office of the Prime Minister was afforded all the power the Constitution mandated. The Shah believed that Cavam wanted to replace him as the head of state, and in retrospect, there is considerable archival evidence to suggest that his fears were not altogether baseless. In fact, Cavam's grandiosity and ambitions had been evident as early as 1918, when he was just a governor in the province of Khorasan. In those days, during official national ceremonies, unless the king was himself president, units of the army and police were expected to march past a portrait of the monarch. However, Cavam often put his own picture in place of the monarch's. As Prime Minister, too, he used every occasion to show his preeminence over the king and embarrass the young Shah. He would sometimes mischievously ignore protocol and show up late to ceremonies, thus arriving after the Shah. On other occasions, when he and the Shah walked side by side, Cavam would, again contrary to protocol, walk a step or two ahead of the Shah. During much of his first decade on the throne, the young Shah used all of his power to block Cavam's appointment as Prime Minister. When he failed, as he did on 3 occasions, he worked behind the scenes to cripple Cavam's cabinets and bring about their demise. Some of these efforts were contrary to the pledge the Shah had made to the nation and to the Allies. He had promised to forego the authoritarian political habits of his father and become instead a constitutional monarch. During those early years, the Shah would often repeat the idea that democracy and the rule of law were the best form of government for Iran, the most suitable form for government. The Shah said on more than one occasion, is democracy, where the spiritually rejuvenating winds of freedom blow. In his first speech after taking the oath of office, he declared, I find it necessary to strictly adhere to the principles of the Constitution and the separation of power. In spite of these pledges, about 4 weeks after taking the oath of office, the Shah sent a secret message to the British ambassador, saying that he would like to see him fairly often, alone, and without the knowledge of politicians. He wished, he said, to have the support of the British Empire, and to work in close agreement with His Majesty's legation with greatest discretion. The ambassador, Sir Reader Bullard, rejected the offer, saying it would not be possible for him to be received without the knowledge of the Persian cabinet and of my Soviet colleagues. A few days earlier, on October 9th, the Shah had tried to form a de facto alliance with the British against the Soviet Union. In both of these meetings, another aspect of the Shah's mature political style began to manifest itself, as in both discussions. The young Shah showed a preoccupation with army matters. The conversations, according to Bullard, were far too much about the army. The Shah's attempt to form a discreet alliance with the British must be understood in the context of his mental state in those days. The British reminded him more than once that the humiliating fate of his father could easily happen to him,
and many of his advisers whispered into his ears that the British had already brought about the abdication of three Shahs, Muhammad Ali, Ahmad Shah, and Reza Shah. The British government continued humiliation of Reza Shah, a man who cast a giant shadow on the mind of the Shah, was in those days another reminder of Britain's intimidating power. The Shah next tried the same tactic with the American ambassador, offering to establish discreet ties with his embassy against the Soviet and British influence, and without the knowledge of the Iranian cabinet. Once again he was politely brushed off, and reminded that he must stay within the confines of the Constitution. These early efforts, and many more in the course of the 1940s, strongly contradict the common perception that the Shah was in the first 12 years of his rule simply a shy and timid constitutional monarch, happy with his ceremonial role. In fact, from the moment he ascended the throne, though he was obviously in a weakened position with the occupying governments of Britain and the Soviet Union, considering him to be on probation, and though both governments had often let him know that they expected him to abide by the Constitution, the Shah made every effort to increase his power and regain as much of his father's lost authority as he could. Even in those early days, he would often declare in private that in Iran, progress is possible only when there is a powerful king. His skirmishes with Khavam, which began as soon as Khavam was named prime minister in August 1942, were a clear example of these early efforts. The British embassy, aware of the Shah's fear and dislike of Khavam, tried to ensure that he survived as prime minister. On December 9, 1942, however, Khavam's tenure all but ended in blood and defeat. On that day, food shortages in Tehran led to bread riots, an intermittent feature of Iranian politics since the time of the Constitutional Revolution. Moreover, since the advent of the World War II, that when food shortages had become a fact of life in Iran, Britain often used delivery of grain, much of it actually gifts to Iran from the United States, as a bargaining chip against the Iranian government. Now that very use of grain and bread was undermining the British plan to keep Khavam in power. The bread riots were accompanied by fairly serious looting. Khavam's house was denuded and set on fire. The army and the police were conspicuous by their absence and by their failure to make any attempt to restore order. Considering the Shah's domination of the military and security forces, the British embassy concluded that the Shah was complicit in the bread riot and its violent turn against Khavam. I cannot acquit the Shah of a share in the responsibility, Bullard concluded. In the midst of the riots, the Shah summoned to the court a number of the Majlis deputies and told them, unless something drastic was done, there could be a revolution from below, and suggested that a revolution from above would be better. What the Shah meant by this revolution was made clear when, in the course of subsequent meeting with the British ambassador, he said that a change of government would be needed to satisfy public opinion and abort the revolution. In future years, the Shah would often refer to these words as his first call to revolution, a call that he claimed he could finally put into action in 1962. The day after the bread riots, the British ambassador was instructed to meet with the Shah urgently and tell him that his attitude was most disappointing, and that the Allies were dismayed at having learned of the attitude taken by His Majesty during the recent disturbances. The British had also learned that the Shah had been conspiring with members of the Majlis to bring about a vote of no confidence against Khavam. The Shah was to be told that Should he try to use the Majlis and its most irresponsible elements against Cavam, the Allies would have no choice but to bring about Parliament's enforced dissolution. Bullard was instructed to the end with a not too subtle threat telling the Shah it is now for him to assert himself in support of the Prime Minister, who has the confidence of the Allies. To the utter surprise of the British and Soviet embassies, the contrary to the image of the young Shah was as a mere malleable tool of the British. Only an hour after meeting with Bullard and receiving the threatening message that virtually ordered him to support Cavam, the Shah called the Prime Minister to the court and pressed him to resign. But Cavam was nothing if not ambitious, and aware that he had the support of the Allies, he ignored the Shah's pressures. Faced with Cavam's intransience, and with the British support for Cavam, the Shah tried another approach. He sounded out Soviet ambassador about the possibility of forming cabinet with considerable military elements, but without Cavam. There, too, he received what he considered a deeply discouraging response. What the Shah failed to realize in those days was that the Soviet Union, Britain, and America were unwilling to endanger their strategic alliance against Hitler simply for some tactical gain in Iran. When the British heard about the Shah's surprising moves against Cavam, even after he had been warned, they sent him a more threatening second message. He was told in so many words that Cavam was the choice of the Allies and must stay in power. This time the Shah saw the writing on the wall, and a few days later, in his next meeting with Bullard, he admitted that he had committed an error of judgment in trying to remove Cavam after promising the British to keep him. The reason, the Shah said, was that the riots had been rapidly getting worse, and in the stress of the moment, Cavam had failed to understand the situation as clearly as he should have. But Cavam was not the Shah's only problem. The Allies' decision to arrest some 200 prominent Iranians on the charge of having pro-Nazi sympathies put the Shah in a quandary. Many of these figures were his staunch allies and supporters, and the Allies did not inform the Shah and the Iranian government of their arrest until after the fact. In Isfahan, when the Allied forces entered the house where the German spy Franz Mayer was hiding, they discovered documents showing the existence in Persia of a wide organization that was preparing a coup against the Allies by seizing aerodromes, blocking roads. Many prominent Persians were amongst those arrested for their alleged roles in the conspiracy. The wording of the British Embassy's conclusion that the Shah himself did not seem to be directly involved in the Germans' conspiracy was hardly a sign of their strong trust or confidence in the Shah. Nevertheless, he registered his dismay at the arrest. In his attempt to navigate between increasingly brazen Soviet and British pressures on him, the Shah found assistance from an unexpected source. In 1942, Franklin D. Roosevelt sent General Patrick Hurley as his personal emissary to Iran. Hurley was an odd and eccentric character. He had made a fortune as an attorney and joined the army in World War I. By the time he was sent to Iran on his mission, he was a general. His cowboy hats and his aversion to the circumlocutions that are part of and parcel of diplomatic discourse made him an oddity in Tehran and put him on collision course with the British ambassador. In Tehran, Hurley was horrified by what he found: abject poverty amongst the people and arrogant disdain for the populations by the British and Soviet ambassadors. Even before Hurley's arrival, officials in the U.S. Embassy had clashed with Britain over the American idea of replacing the corrupt political personalities that dominated the Iranian scene with younger, westernized technocrats. The British dismissed these suggestions as absurdly utopian, a sign of America's dangerous naivete about Iran. Most of the personalities thus criticized by the American embassy had long reputations of being friendly with the British. As he attended to his sensitive role of managing the logistics of the 1943 Tehran Conference, with Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt all attending, Hurley began a series of meetings with Iranian officials, particularly the Shah, when Roosevelt came to Iran. Hurley briefed him on the situation. In fact, on his way out of Tehran at the airport, Roosevelt had a long conversation with Hurley and then asked him to turn the gist of their conversation into a report about the future of U.S. policy in Iran. The often maligned and ignored Hurley report became the first blueprint for American efforts to promote democracy in Iran, and then the rest of the Muslim Middle East. Hurley began his report by suggesting that Iran, as a country rich in natural resources, stood a good chance of becoming a free and independent nation with a government, based upon the consent of the governed. Aside from the domestic scourge of illiteracy, the other obstacle to democracy in Iran was, according to Hurley, the machinations of the twin colonial powers of Great Britain and the Soviet Union. The general rallied against the idea that noble American blood was being shed in the ignoble effort to maintain what he considered the moribund British Empire and the expansionist Soviet Union. Roosevelt found the report interesting, and along the lines of his own thoughts, he sent a copy to Churchill, maybe more in mischief than in earnest consultation, writing in an accompanying note. This is for your eyes only. I rather like this general approach. Churchill took umbrage at this clear snub. He waited almost 3 months before he chose to respond. Using his legendary wit, he wrote, "I make bold, however, to suggest that British imperialism has spread and is spreading democracy more widely than any other system of government since the beginning of time." He ended his chiding note by insisting that Britain is certainly no less interested than the U.S. in encouraging Persian independence, political efficiency, and native reform. During these months, as the Shah fought on many fronts, he also had to contend with the issue of his father's fate. The British seemed bent on doing everything they could to humiliate the once proud Reza Shah. From the moment he had left Tehran, the British had controlled his every move, reminding him more than once that he was in fact no more than a prisoner of war. More than once, when Reza Shah asked about his destination, the young British officer who was accompanying him refused to answer, claiming ignorance. In reality, even as early as the time the entourage was in the city of Kerman, about 700 miles south of Tehran, the British had already decided that Reza Shah would be sent to Mauritius. A few days later, when Reza Shah and his family boarded the ship that was to take them away from Iran, they were not told their destination. When the ship, a cargo ship used for carrying mail, finally anchored off the waters of India, Reza Shah and his entourage wanted to disembark for a visit. In Tehran, they had received visas for India, but now they were told that in spite of their visas, they could not disembark, nor would their destination necessarily be India. Distraught and angry, Reza Shah sent a tartly worded telegram to the British Viceroy of India, complaining about the treatment he had been receiving. Before leaving Tehran, he wrote, "I was informed through British minister in Tehran that British government agreed my going to America with my family, and it was on this understanding that I left Iran. Now I have been arrested at Bombay and have been told that I cannot go to America. Back in Tehran, the Shah had made every effort to ensure his father's physical safety, emotional sanctity, and human dignity. The boat anchored off Bombay for 5 days, and Reza Shah spent most of the hot, humid days walking along the deck. Eventually, Reza Shah learned that he was being sent to the island of Mauritius. Again he wrote to British authorities asking whether the decision to send him there was taken after I had left Iran, or whether it was in accordance with deliberate policy of British government. He further reminded them that in Tehran he had been promised safe passage to the Americas. In their internal deliberations, the British agreed that Bullard might have given Reza Shah the impression that he would be allowed a temporary stay in India, followed by permanent refuge in South America. But now they decided to tell the unkinged Reza Shah that the British government had never agreed that he should go to America. While they were pondering his fate, the Secretary of State for Colonies informed the governor of Mauritius that he had full discretion to restrict Reza Shah and his family's freedom, and that their correspondence must be fully censored, and if necessary, Persian-speaking clerk should probably be sent from India. For much of his 7-month stay on the island, September 1941 to April 1942, Reza Shah and his entourage received no communications from Tehran. By then, the British found themselves in something of a quandary about Reza Shah. On the one hand, they worried that he was becoming part of another Napoleon legend. Persians, the British embassy, opined in its imitable tone, are not a logical race. In another note, during the same week, they called Persians base people who might now be inclined to create a Pahlavi legend. The British were in fact worried that Reza Shah is now becoming popular again as the alleged victim of the British cruelty. The myth is being created that we got rid of the Shah because he defended the independence of Persia and wanted to modernize the country. Bullard, as usual, favored the most brutal answer to the fallen Reza Shah's request. He wrote, "We are not under any obligation, moral or contractual, expressed or implied, in this matter. The Shah may say that when he abdicated to facilitate our plans, he put his trust in the British government to let him retire to any neutral country which he might select. But if the prisoner at the bar pleads guilty, that does not put the judge under any obligation to let him off hard labor, even if he may thereby have signed the crown the trouble of prolonged case." However, after some time, the British attitude toward Reza Shah changed a bit. He was eventually allowed to receive letters and packages from Iran. In the first handwritten note he sent to his father, the new Shah wrote that the grandeur and dignity your Imperial Majesty's presence had afforded Iran has now dissipated with your departure. In the meantime, Reza Shah and his son both pressured the British government to move the fallen king and his entourage to a new location. Eventually, the British succumbed to the wishes of the father and son and arranged for Reza Shah's transfer to South Africa on April 10, 1942. South America and Canada were both ruled out, and South Africa was the only place the British felt safely far from Iran, where they could keep close watch on the fallen Reza Shah. The trip took 8 days. Reza Shah was told there was German submarine activity in the area, causing considerable delay. They landed in Durban on April 18th, 1942, and Reza Shah was immediately taken by the gaiety and urban vivacity of his new place of exile. The house set aside for him was too small for his entourage, and a new house was hard to find in the city. Ultimately, they moved to Johannesburg, where he and his family first stayed in a hotel and then rented two adjoining half-completed houses. Even in Johannesburg, Reza Shah was depressed and despondent. In a letter from exile, written only 17 days before his death, he wrote to his son about his fears of the future and offered some advice. He wrote of his own despondency, confessing that the only thing that kept him alive was the slim hope of one day seeing his son and the rest of the family again. Those who saw Reza Shah in South Africa describe a broken man, bereft of any desire to live. Without a hope of seeing you, he wrote to the Shah, I would no longer have any attachment to life. While heaping praise on his son for his love of country and his youth, he also warned against the danger of listening to sycophants. He asked his son to fortify his courage, fight his anxieties, and remain strong. Be firm and steadfast, he told his son. Fear nothing, as a single mistake by you might well destroy your efforts of 20 years and sully your family name. Never succumb to anxiety. Remain so resolute that no force can change your determined will. But in trying to heed his father's last wishes and maintain the throne and preserve the dynasty, the Shah was fighting against not just a destiny determined by his character, but also a strong current of Iranian history that underscored the crisis of monarchy as an institution. In the early morning of July 26, 1944, Reza Shah died of what doctors described as a heart attack, and his family believed was heartbreak. He died a broken man. Days before his death, a local paper published a scathing attack on Reza Shah, an article full of insults and accusations, according to his chief of staff, and Reza Shah was not only saddened by the article, but believed it to be the work of secret hands pursuing him even as far away as Johannesburg. Now he was dead, and he had requested to be buried back in Iran. But bringing back the body to the country at that time, for political reasons, untenable. Leaving it in South Africa, a non-Muslim land, was also a political liability. The embalmed body was laid to temporary rest at the Royal Al Rifas, a mosque in Cairo. Some £5,000 were spent moving Reza Shah's coffin from South Africa to Egypt. After many months, the Shah finally decided to reinter the body of his father. Even the Iranian cabinet was opposed to this relocation, worried about the public reaction to such a move. The Shah sent the cabinet an angry message saying their attitude was an insult to his father, which he would not brook. The Shah went on to show unusual determination to bring the body back and overcome the cabinet's resistance. He still had two other obstacles to overcome: the Egyptian government, by then indignant of the Shah's relations with Fawzia, and said it would refuse to stage any ceremonies in Cairo to mark the reinterment. Finally, when the body was on its way to Iran, the Shah declared his intention to inter the body in the grounds of the Said Abad Palace, a place he knew his father loved. But the clergy opposed the idea, producing a ruling to the effect that the body, which had been temporarily interred in non-Shia ground, must, if reinterred in Persia, lie in the proximity of the shrine of the Imam. Obviously, the most important shrine in Iran was the Masjid, where Imam Reza was buried, and the Shah decided he wanted his father buried there. The choice was dictated more by the Shah's own desires and beliefs than by those of his father, who had, in his prime, used heavy artillery against rabble-rousing clerics who had taken refuge in the Meshed shrine. The clergy had not forgotten this transgression, and helped by the more religious members of the bazaar, they successfully opposed the idea of Reza Shah's burial in the city. The Shah's second choice was Qum, but the clergy in the city also successfully blocked the move. After all, a few years earlier, Reza Shah had defied tradition and transgressed against the shrine too, walking into the most sacred parts of the monument in his military boots. Ultimately, a new mausoleum, inspired by Napoleon's burial place at Les Invalides in Paris, was built for Reza Shah in the city of Rev, not far from Tehran.